Hey guys, we are going to start our lesson on World War One. Those of you who had Global 10, some of this is going to be a bit of a review, but really our focus in U.S. history is looking at the war and the impact it has on the United States. Okay, so let's just get started really fast. The immediate cause of World War One, the thing that sets it off, is this gentleman at the top of the page. His name is Gavrilo Princip. He is a Serbian person. He is under the rule, him and other Serbian people are being ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He doesn't like that, so he murders Franz Ferdinand. He kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Okay, and that murder is what kind of sets off World War One. However, that was just one death. Really, the bigger cause of World War One, and really where our focus is on the underlying causes. And you can remember those underlying causes by the mnemonic Maine. And you should know Maine anyway, because remember, Maine, the sinking of the USS Maine, is one of the causes of the Spanish-American War. And now, when you think of Maine, it is also is the underlying causes for World War One. And what does Maine stand for? Maine stands for M, militarism, A, alliances, I, imperialism, and nationalism. Just really, really fast, because every once in a blue moon this does come up on the U.S. history regents. The word militarism is referring to the fact that these nations of Europe, as well as the United States, had built up its military. They were very, very strong. So the idea of going to war didn't scare them, didn't worry them. They were very happy to use this military strength to engage in war. Alliances. This is the idea that in Europe, they had this alliance system. So what happens is instead of a fight being between two countries and staying small, because of the alliance system, a bunch of other countries kind of jump into the war. So a disagreement between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the people of Serbia ends up instead exploding and pulling in all the other nations of Europe and creates a world war. So the alliances that fight in World War One are the Triple Entente versus the Allies. Just so you know, the United States takes the side of the Allies. So it's part of the Allied Nation alliance. All right. Another reason for World War One is imperialism. What happens is, as you remember, imperialism is when a stronger nation takes over a weaker nation. Well, what happens is by the time we're into the early 1900s, most of the weaker nations of the world have already been conquered. So what that means is if you want to grow your global empire, you need to take somebody else's colonies because there's no place left to kind of take over. So again, this is another motivation for war. If you go to war and you win, you're going to end up winning some new colonies, okay? And then finally, nationalism. Remember, love for your country, love for your nation. So again, this kind of love for your country is going to push a lot of people to sign up, to defend their country, to fight in a war. And naturally, I mean, that was the whole cause of the war to begin with, right? Why does Gavrilo Princip kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Because he feels nationalism, because he wants Serbian people to be ruled by Serbians. He does not want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that act of terrorism is actually caused by nationalism as well. All right. So the other thing you should bear in mind when it comes to World War One is the trench war, okay? As you can see from the map, there's two red lines, right? There's one on the right side and the left side. Basically, there were two lines of trenches, and a photo of a trench is what you see on the left side. This idea that you dig down a hole into the earth and then you fire your guns out of this hole. What happens is during World War One, there were two trenches. They were basically on either side of Germany. And what you see with trench warfare is a lot of people die and you do not see huge movements. These lines of trenches actually don't move that much. There's not that much change. And a lot of people die because of trench warfare. There are also new weapons introduced in World War One: tanks, poison gas, machine guns, U-boats. That means underwater boats. That's the old-fashioned name for a submarine. And between the trenches and these new weapons, there are lots and lots of deaths. This war, World War One, kills a lot of people because of this new technology and trench warfare. All right, now, when it comes to the United States, At the start of this war, the U.S. is a strong believer in isolationism. Europe's problems should stay in Europe. This war, as you saw, if you remember the map I showed you earlier, this trench warfare is going on the European continent. So as far as the United States goes, it's not our problem. This is a war being fought in Europe, and we want to stay out of it. We follow a foreign policy of isolationism. All right. So again, this policy of isolationism, this policy of neutrality, this is something that we follow in 1915. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson says, listen, we're not going to get involved in this war in Europe. It's not our problem. Most Americans agree with this. And this has been the advice for, if you guys remember, this policy of stay out of European affairs, don't get involved, America. Thanks to this big ocean that separates us from Europe, we shouldn't get involved. This starts with what president? What president started this? Do you remember from early on? George Washington. Remember, in his farewell address, he was the one who said, U.S., stay isolated, stay neutral. And now, even though we're neutral in the war, at the end of the day, when it comes to whose side we would be on, economically, we have a much stronger tie to the Allies. We have much stronger economic ties to England and France and these countries that are on the side of the Allied nations. So economically, we're hoping those guys win, but generally speaking, we don't want any part of the fighting. And that's what most Americans believe in as well. What happens is World War I only really starts to affect us because Germany decides to quarantine the British Isles. That means that U.S. ships that trade with Britain, we can't get through that quarantine. And what happens is we kind of push through to when we want to trade with Europe. German U-boats. So remember what I told you, U-boats was underwater boats, means submarines. A lot of these German submarines were starting to sink U.S. ships or any of these ships that were trying to trade with Britain. So this is going to be one of the reasons why eventually the United States will be pulled into World War I. All right. And what happens is you start seeing the Germans are warning us. They say, listen, stay out. Don't trade with England. Because, of course, they want England is their enemy. Germany's enemy is England. And they don't want the U.S. to trade with England. They want to hurt them economically. So they say, listen, if you are, going to run your ships into England, you're going to be in danger. Don't do it. So they say you're risking your own ships. This is one of the big reasons why the United States ends up getting pulled in to war in World War I, is because these German U-boats, these submarines, sink the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania, as you can see on the cover of the New York Times, this was actually not a warship, okay? So this is not a military ship. It's actually a passenger ship. It's a cruise line. And this cruise line, this British cruise line, is carrying Americans. And so what happens is 128 Americans die. And this kind of unrestricted naval warfare, this is like the big reason. The fact that the German Navy is targeting ships that are traveling, that are not involved directly with the war, but are just traveling through the ocean. The fact that the Germans are sinking them, this is one of the big reasons why the U.S. gets pulled in, because of this unrestricted naval warfare. By targeting neutral ships, by targeting U.S. ships that are doing trade with England, this starts to change U.S. opinion, because we say, how dare they? Now, like I said, the reason why they were sinking this ship wasn't all innocent. Supposedly it did have guns and things like that also being carried by this passenger ship, and that's why the Germans target them. But from the perspective of most Americans, they see this innocent passenger ship getting sunk by German submarines, and people get really upset about it. The other big cause of the United States getting pulled into World War I is the Zimmermann Note. What happens is the Germans want the United States to stay out of the war. The Germans want us to stay neutral. So they basically have this idea, and the Germans approach the Mexicans and say, look, Mexico, you lost a lot of territory to the United States. Remember, the whole southeastern part of the United States, California, New Mexico, Arizona, even Texas, right? That those all used to be part of Mexico. And now Texas was a little bit different, but the rest of it we had gotten because of the Mexican-American War. What the Germans say to Mexico is, listen, if you guys will fight with the US, like if you start a fight with the United States over this land, as soon as we're done fighting World War I, we'll come over and we'll help you win back your land. Because the Germans figure if the United States is focused on a fight with Mexico, they won't get involved in a fight in Europe. So that's the idea. A fight with Mexico would keep the United States focused on its own problems and would keep the United States out of the war in Europe. So that is Germany's goal. What happens is the United States ends up getting a copy of this Zimmermann Note. We see the telegram. And this enrages Americans. How dare they try to get us, to try to start this kind of fight with us? So it doesn't move forward. The Mexicans don't agree to it or anything, but we just find out about this plan. And between, like I said, the unrestricted naval warfare and the Zimmermann Note, America gets pulled into World War I. So again, this is some of the things this was like a quote from the Zimmermann Telegraph, that basically the Germans made Mexico this proposal that we will financially help you if you try to reconquer your lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. And like I said, between the unrestricted naval warfare and hearing about this telegram, Americans say, we got to kick Germany's butt. All right. So what happens is the United States will enter World War I. And the famous quote from Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president, is that the world must be safe for democracy. And this idea that Germany, when it attacks merchant ships, again, not military vessels, but ships trying to trade with Europe, by attacking those ships, Germany is violating freedom of the seas. And therefore, that is what drags America into this war, that we have to make America safe for democracy and we have to protect freedom of the seas. Okay? And so again, like I said, these are some kind of posters. This one on the left, this is kind of a propaganda poster from World War I, and this kind of idea of how dare the Huns, which is another way of saying Germans, attack. And again, this is a photo of a World War I era German submarine. All right, so again, like I said, the big focus for U.S. history is what effect the World War I will have on America. And one of the big effects is that you see a Selective Service Act being passed. Selective Service Act basically means a draft. Even today, this is true, all men must register. This may change because now with women are starting to get pulled into combat, this may change, but all men must register to be drafted. If you guys try to get any kind of loans for colleges and things like that, you're going to be asked to sign up for selective service. So all American men are expected to, all American male citizens must register for the draft. That's what the Selective Service Act says. That way we can call up soldiers for the war. Now, African American men are also part of this. African American men are expected to serve in the Army. However, they will serve in segregated units. So white soldiers are kept separate from black soldiers. Women are not drafted. They are not subject to the draft. However, a lot of women do volunteer to fight in the war, but they take positions that wouldn't require them to fight. So, for example, they might serve as nurses or secretaries or something like that. Just to let you know, American Indians do not have to register for the Selective Service Act. As of World War I, Native Americans, so American Indians, are not citizens of the United States, so therefore they are not subject to the draft. They do not serve in World War I. All right, so again, the U.S. is going to enter World War I. One of the things you should be aware of is what's known as the Convoy System. This is something that the U.S. uses to protect cargo and merchant ships, and basically there's photos there, that basically groups of ships would travel as a big group, and that would help them protect themselves from German submarines. The other big thing you need to know about the U.S. in World War One is the fact that the president has special wartime powers. Okay, really important to remember, and this is still true today, that we have wartime powers, that the government can control the economy. Normally, the United States is a capitalist economy. Under capitalism, companies are owned and controlled by private citizens. The government does not control business, right? That's socialism, that's communism. Normally, that's not okay for the US to have a role in business. Usually, you leave that to private people. But in war, things change. In war, it's different. The government can take control of the economy. So, for example, President Wilson can form a war industry board. And the war industry board can set prices and regulate any industry that has anything to do with war. Okay? So any business that has any relationship to war or war related needs gets regulated by the government. So, for example, steel, copper, rubber, these are raw materials that are used by the Army. Okay? The Army needs a lot of steel, copper, and rubber. And because of that, the government can literally say to industry, you don't get to use rubber. You don't get to use steel. Okay, so if you want to build a bicycle or you want to build a steel building, you can't do it during war. The Army gets first dibs. You must use less of that. It tells manufacturers what to make and how much. And again, it is the government that's going to decide who gets what raw materials, because most of the raw materials have to go to the Army first. We also see during World War I a shift. For example, you see this right now. This is the Emerson Electric Company. This normally would be a kind of company. Emerson makes like radios and TVs and other, regular electronic, like, I don't know that they had TVs yet. I take that back. They were making radios and like vacuum cleaners and like, a refrigerator, let's say. Instead of making that stuff, instead of making consumer goods, instead, as you can see, they're actually building gun turrets. So these are going to be used in war. These are weapons for war. So as you can see, regular private companies are forced to start making weapons and war supplies instead of making consumer goods. All right. Oh, by the way, when it comes to this and this, you should know this is actually kind of interesting. Today, right now, Donald Trump is using this power, these presidential powers, to try to push private industries to build supplies that are needed to fight the coronavirus. So this same kind of wartime power is one of the things that for example, instead of making normal consumer goods, he can tell people to build respirators, tell private companies to build respirators, and tell companies, to engage in that kind of thing. That's one of the powers that the president can use today. So it actually comes out of a war-making ability. All right. Another thing that happens in World War I is rationing. Okay, rationing means, again, food, not just raw materials, not just weapons, but food has to go to the Army first. So what happens is, you can see the second picture in the row. You see where it says your ration book. During World War I, individual people would get ration books. So what happens is you could not buy as much bread as you wanted to. They rationed it out. So as you can see on the left, it says save the wheat, help the fleet, eat less bread. So again, as an individual, you're told eat less bread, save the bread for the armies. You can see on the right, they were also encouraging individuals and people at home to plant their own food. To, instead of buying food at the grocery store, leave that food that's manufactured, leave that for the Army. Instead, plant a garden and use the food you grow yourself. That's what you should eat. So again, you're leaving more supplies for the armies. This is another example of rationing. So, for example, your sugar ration is 2 pounds a month. This, if you could use less than 2 pounds per month, you allow that sugar to go to the allies in England, France, and Italy. So that's the idea, that we're asking Americans to use less sugar so that we can use that sugar for U.S. troops and to send that to our allies in Europe. Another thing that happens in World War I is the sale of war bonds. So this is a way for the U.S. government to raise money for its army. So to have money to buy ammunition, you would be asked to buy a war bond. So you can see the examples on the right. So basically what it is you buy a war bond for whatever amount of money it costs, and the U.S. gets your cash and gives you a bond in exchange. And what happens is after the war is over, you can turn in your bond and get your money. You can get a little extra money in. So it's like you're loaning, it's like a loan that you give the government. By buying the bond, you basically are loaning the government money, and later after the war, the government will pay you back. The government will give you whatever the cost of the bond was. All right. The other part of the home front that you should know in World War I is, since men are out fighting in World War I, somebody has to work in the factories. And the people who are going to be working in the factories are often women and African Americans. Okay. So again, because a lot of men are going to be fighting out in the war, these jobs are now going to be available to women and African Americans. So remember, women are going to argue that they should have the right to vote. One of the reasons why they're able to win support for that is because they were the ones kind of carrying the burden of going to work during World War I. So in exchange, that was one of the reasons why they said they were entitled to the vote. For African Americans, you should remember the Great Migration. Remember, a lot of African Americans leave the South because of Jim Crow laws and lynching and things like that. And they are traveling north looking for the factory jobs that now exist thanks to World War I. Usually those factory jobs would go to white men. They would get first dibs. But because a lot of white men are out fighting in World War I, these jobs are available to African Americans. They're desperate enough for workers that they're willing to hire African Americans. So this gets a lot of African Americans to travel up north. All right. And the only other thing you should be aware of is during this war, we see, like, this is kind of that end of that progressive era push for unions. What happens is because of World War I, people are kind of anti-union, anti-striking. They're like, listen, if you hurt American business, you're hurting the war effort. So a lot of the unions kind of agree to not strike during the war. All right. And that's it. Thank you so much. And good luck answering your Google quiz.